Okay. Hi, Vermont history students. Welcome to the second video of the 12 that we'll have. And this is the video for Unit 2, which is the second part of Part 1 of the course and essentially constitutes the work that you would be doing on today, Wednesday, and Thursday. What we need to do is on Friday, there's one discussion question for the week, and I want to introduce that to you so that you feel enabled to answer it by Friday morning. And that means I want to give you some content, but not too much in hopefully what's going to be a brief video. I also want to have a measure of where we are, and I need to make sure that I nail down the uphill-downhill orientations that are such a crucial part of this course, and I'll be dividing you into those two categories tomorrow so that you are enabled and feel ready to do town meeting, which is by next Monday. And what you'll be doing is reading the instructions that I put for the first town meeting online, and then after that responding on to the discussion board to the questions that I ask about the three primary documents you will be addressing. We had great answers. I've gotten introductions from 4 of the 6 of you, which is good. I'd like to have the other 2 of you write in soon. We had excellent answers to the the 2 discussion questions that were for today. There was maybe a little bit too much consensus on them. You know, in history you're trying to sow discontent and conflict, and people all agreed that it doesn't matter if it's Ethan's house or not, as if like it doesn't matter if Monticello is Thomas Jefferson's house, but that's fine. If the symbolism is good enough. And so I think that generally speaking the course is up and running, but of course please write me if you have any questions. Put questions in the on the discussion board in the syllabus questions folder so everyone can see them, and tell me what I can do to make your life happy. So far, of course, in Unit 1, we got up to about 1775. That's the Westminster Massacre year, on the verge of the Revolution. The important points are Vermont emerged out of a land dispute. New Hampshire had handed out land grants in the 1750s. After the French and Indian War, New York began to hand out land grants to the same territory. England, the Privy Council in England declared New York had jurisdiction over the land, but there were already people living there, and the common farmers who settled Vermont in the 1760s tended to settle on New Hampshire grants because they were cheap, and they tended to settle on the tops of hills. They put their houses on the tops of hills, and their first villages, what came to be what usually called the center in villages, like Bennington Center, they put their villages on the tops of hills for very practical reasons, to maximize arable land and to avoid frosts. And so that's the sort of like uphill orientation of the beginning of the state. Through this, after 1771 in particular, with the Albany Court, you have the Green Mountain Boys era on the west side of the state, and of course these people were outlaws against New York authority. They were insurgents, the Bennington Mob as they were referred to, and the Green Mountain Boys fought New York authority. There's a big difference between the east side and the west side of the state. People on the east side tended to be more pious, larger family groups, wealthier people. They were led by a guy named Jacob Bailey, who settled in Newbury and bought both New York and New Hampshire grants. He didn't really care, but he wanted to make money and settle his family there. And so what you get when the Constitution is written, it's important to understand it as an attempt to balance the needs of a whole bunch of different people. After the Westminster Massacre, which made a lot of Eastern people sympathetic to the Green Mountain Boys' cause, a month later, Lexington and Concord happens, the revolution starts, and then, you know, chaos breaks out. And so over the next year or two, there are a number of meetings, first only on the west side, in Dorset first, and then gradually including East Siders, leading up to the writing of the state constitution in '77. And the state constitution is an attempt to balance the needs of a bunch of different kinds of people with different aspirations. And that what the founders wanted to do was make Vermont such an exciting idea that people who are skeptical about Vermont, can a bunch of common farmers create a entity, a 14th state, against the resistance of Congress, and particularly against the resistance of New York? It needed to be an exciting idea to attract people, and what the founders came up with was freedom and unity, that Vermont would be an experiment in human living that would reconcile the most profound contradictions of the human experience. Everyone wants to be free. Everyone wants to live in a community where people make sacrifices for the common good, for the well-being of all. And what they did was they got Pennsylvania's and Connecticut's new constitutions, and they picked and chose what they liked from those, And then what they did was modify them so that it would reflect what people in Vermont wanted. The first clause banned slavery, which Pennsylvania had said they were going to do on a gradual basis. Vermont did it with some modifications, but anyway, they basically got rid of slavery with the first clause of the Constitution. But then the second clause is an eminent domain clause. What it says is that people who have something the state needs must sacrifice that thing with sufficient compensation, appropriate compensation. So there's like a freedom clause and a unity clause, and the whole Constitution is like that, balancing between freedom and unity, needs of individuals and needs of communities. And that's what Vermont was about then, and what it's about now is balance. Vermont's always been about balance. It's about balance between tradition and progress, preservation and development, freedom and unity, and a bunch of other poles. And it tries to make it so that Vermont's trying to prove that life isn't a zero-sum game, that the more tradition you have, the less progress you have, or the more development you have, the less preservation you have. Vermont's trying to prove, always, that you can have both and they can actually cultivate and encourage each other. And so then off you go. Now, another important event that happens in '77, practically but also symbolically, is that Vermont got its first lawyer, which is really when downhill Vermont begins. His name was Isaac Ticonor. He settled in Bennington, but not on top of the hill, but down at the mill village. And the mills tend to be along the rivers, of course, and the people who are professionals, doctors, lawyers, businessmen, professionals, tended to settle down in the mill village, because that's where the economic activity was, that's where the greatest access to the outside world was, the best access to information. And so what you end up having is, in Bennington and then across the state, a geographical orientation, where the hill farmers are on the tops of the hills and the downhillers are down in the mill villages. It's geographical, although it's been reversed now, of course. Downhillers tend to have big houses out in the country, and uphillers live in St. Johnsbury. So a lot of things about the uphill-downhill thing evolve enormously over time. It's about where you live. It's about employment. It's the difference between hill farmers and lawyers. It's about ethnicity to a great extent over time. It meant more in the past maybe than it does now, but between Yankees and French Canadians. It is a very much of a, it has elements of nativity in it. It's really the 1970s that the Flatlander thing really kicks in big time. Downhillers are from Vermont too, but uphillers tend to live, it's not just being born in Vermont, but also staying in the same town for multiple generations. Someone who's been in town for 5 generations is different from someone who just got there, whether they're born in Vermont or not, because community comes out of shared experiences. Community is not buildings and trees and rocks and ground. Community accrues over time, like a coral reef, you know, and so the people who've lived in a town for a long time have a different experience with that town than people who just got there. So all those things, but the uphill-downhill dialectic revolves around. But what it's about is values. Uphillers are informal, agricultural, traditional, and downhillers are competitive, formal, legalistic, cosmopolitan. And off they go. By the early 1780s, this conflict is really clear across the state, increasingly moving from south to north as the state is increasingly settled. In this independence period, Vermont doesn't become a state until 1791. A good illustration of how this is true across the state is in 1780 there was a fist fight in the state legislature between an uphiller, Matthew Lyon, who supported a law that took land away from loyalists and sold it to people sympathetic to Vermont, which is a win-win situation because you get rid of people you don't like, you attract people you do like, and they pay the state expenses when they buy land. And this law was opposed by a guy named Nathaniel Chipman, who was a Yale-trained lawyer, who thought it violated everything about Blackstonian property law that existed, which it did. And when they began to argue about this, Chipman called Lyon a sick Irish puppy, and Lyon then went and attacked Chipman, began to try to beat him up, and Chipman's friends grabbed Lyon and put him behind this big cabinet and pushed him against it. And so you have fist fights in the state legislature between uphillers and downhillers by 1780, really soon. This exists across the state like that. It exists on local places. Bennington went through 8 ministers in 10 years in the 1780s because you'd get an uphill minister who'd say, believe whatever you want, and then downhillers would get frustrated and they'd get rid of him. They'd bring in a Yale guy and he would say, sit down and shut up and listen to me, and the uphillers would get frustrated. So this social conflict exists both on a statewide level and in local places by the 1780s. And so I need to divide you into this uphill and downhill people, and I'll just do it alphabetically, I imagine. It really doesn't matter what you are. But ultimately what you have to appreciate is that this exists by the 1780s and 90s. Of course, it still exists today, although it's massively different, and you're going to see it evolve over time. And you need to be equipped actually to handle the town meeting. Your answers should be by next Monday. And I think that's mostly everything. I want you to especially focus on section 4 of the outline, because that'll hopefully explain the uphill-downhill thing best. And then you get to your discussion question. I'd like to have answers by Friday morning. And the question is, when the uphill-downhill division emerged, is that balance? I mean, does that move the state closer to its effort to accomplish the perfect balance, or is it an obstacle to that? Does it hinder the effort to reconcile freedom and unity? Basically what it's asking is the balance between freedom and unity something that exists inside each of us that we're trying to reconcile, or does it exist between competing groups? Which is a rather more philosophical way of looking at it than you need to do by Friday morning. Just basically, is uphill and downhill orientations, do they balance each other? And does that move us closer to reconcile freedom and unity, or are they an obstacle to accomplishing that fabulous goal that Vermont's founders set out for us in 1777? So answer that question by Friday. Town meeting answers by Monday. Get in touch with me if you have any questions. I want to help. If you have any questions about the syllabus, put them in the discussion board folder for it. And hopefully the course is, so far,